Corin Whitmore could not breathe. He lay on the great bed in the north tower, his chest rising and falling in short broken gasps, his skin the color of old candle wax. Sweat soaked through the silk sheets beneath him, though the room was cold enough to see breath in the air. Outside, rain hammered the tower windows, and thunder rolled over the hills like something enormous turning in its sleep. Duke Alden Whitmore stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the wooden frame so hard his knuckles had gone white. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, a man used to commanding armies and courts and the loyalty of 1,000 men. But here, in this room, watching his only son fight for air, he was nothing but a father, and fathers are the weakest creatures alive when their children are dying. "Do something," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. Dr. Elian Vance did not look up from the boy's wrist, where his fingers pressed for a pulse that kept slipping away and coming back like a candle flickering in a draught. He was the finest physician in the whole duchy, trained in the capital, published twice in the royal medical journals, and right now he had absolutely no idea what was killing the boy in front of him. "Your Grace, I need quiet," Vance said, though his own hands were trembling. Corin's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, but for one terrible moment they found his father's face across the room, and his lips moved. "Father," he whispered, "it's cold." It was not cold. The fire in the hearth roared high enough to light the whole tower orange, but Corin shivered like a man buried in snow, and Alden felt something break open in his chest that he had no name for. "Get him more blankets," Alden barked at the servants crowded near the door. 3 girls scrambled at once, nearly colliding with each other in their hurry, and one of them, a young woman named Nell Bridger, stopped in the doorway and looked back at the bed with an expression that was not fear. It was something closer to helpless fury, the look of someone watching a wrong thing happen and being told there is nothing they can do about it. This had been going on for 6 days. It started small, the way these things always do. A cough after supper. A slight fever the healers dismissed as nothing more than a chill from riding in the rain. But by the second day the fever had climbed high enough that Corin's skin burned to the touch, and by the third day he had stopped eating, and by the fourth day he had stopped speaking in full sentences, drifting instead between confused mutterings and long silences that frightened everyone more than screaming would have. Now it was the 6th day, and the boy who had once raced his horse across the eastern fields laughing so loud the stable hands could hear him from half a mile away could not lift his own head from the pillow. "His pulse is weakening again," Vance said, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. He turned to the second physician standing near the window, a narrow, nervous man named Roland Pike, who had been summoned from 2 counties over at great expense and greater urgency. "Roland, the tincture, now." Pike fumbled with a small glass bottle, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it before Vance snatched it from him and forced a few drops between Corin's cracked lips. The boy swallowed weakly. Nothing changed. The fever did not break. The shivering did not stop. Alden watched all of this with the growing, sickening certainty that these men, for all their letters and their fine coats and their confident Latin phrases, did not know what they were doing. "What is wrong with him?" Alden said. It was not a question anymore. It was a demand sharpened by 5 days of the same non-answer. Vance straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. When he spoke, his voice had the careful, practiced calm of a man who had learned long ago how to sound certain even when he was not. "It could be a corruption of the blood, Your Grace, or a disturbance of the lungs brought on by the damp air of the eastern ride. We have tried bleeding, we have tried the standard tinctures, we have." "You have tried everything except helping him," Alden said. The room went silent except for the rain and the ragged sound of his son's breathing. Vance's jaw tightened. "Your Grace, I understand your distress, but medicine is not magic. We are doing everything within the bounds of proper science." "Then proper science is failing my son," Alden said, and his voice finally broke completely, the anger draining out of it and leaving only raw fear behind. Look at him. Look at him and tell me proper science has done one single thing to help. Nobody answered because nobody could. Corin's breathing hitched again, a horrible catching sound, and for 3 full seconds he did not breathe at all. Alden's heart stopped along with him. Then the boy gasped, a wet, ragged inhale, and the room exhaled with him, everyone remembering to breathe at once. Vance pressed 2 fingers to the boy's throat again, counting silently, his lips moving with the numbers. When he finished, he did not meet the Duke's eyes. His heart is racing even as his body weakens, Vance said quietly. That combination is not favorable. Say what you mean, Alden said. Vance hesitated. Pike, near the window, looked down at the floor. I mean that if this fever does not break by tomorrow morning, Your Grace, Vance said, each word coming slower than the last, I do not believe his body will have the strength to fight it any longer. The words landed in the room like something physical, like a weight dropped from the ceiling. Alden did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared at the physician as though the man had spoken in a language he did not understand, though every syllable had been perfectly clear. Behind him, near the doorway, Nell Bridger felt her own throat close up. She had served in this household since she was 11 years old. She had watched Corin grow from a small boy who stole apples from the kitchen to a young man who still, even now, remembered her name and asked after her mother whenever their paths crossed in the halls. He was not just the heir to the duchy to her. He was a person, a real one, with a laugh she had heard 1,000 times and might never hear again. She looked at Vance, at his fine coat and his fine words and his hands that had done nothing but watch a boy die slowly for 6 days, and something inside her hardened into a decision before she had even fully thought it through. There was a woman in the village by the river. The physicians called her a hedge witch, a fraud, an old fool who sold weeds to peasants too poor or too foolish to afford real medicine. The kitchen staff called her something else. They called her Marin, and they said that when the miller's youngest daughter had the wasting cough 2 winters ago, the one every proper doctor said would kill her before spring, it was Marin's bitter-smelling tea that brought the color back to the child's cheeks within a week. Nell had heard the story a dozen times. She had never given it much thought until this exact moment, standing in a doorway watching 2 educated men in fine coats admit, in their careful roundabout way, that they had already given up. She did not ask permission. She knew what the answer would be if she did, and she did not have time to argue about it. She turned and ran down the tower stairs, through the kitchen, out into the storm, her thin shoes slapping against wet stone, rain soaking through her dress within seconds, her breath tearing in her chest as she ran the full mile to the river village without stopping once. Back in the tower, Alden Whitmore sank slowly into the chair beside his son's bed, the same chair he had sat in for 6 sleepless nights, and took Corin's burning hand in both of his own. "Stay with me," he whispered, so quietly that only the boy could have heard it if the boy could hear anything at all anymore. "Please, stay with me." Corin's eyes were closed. His chest rose. It fell. It rose again, slower this time, the pause between breaths stretching a little longer than it had before. Outside, the storm did not weaken. If anything, it grew louder, the wind screaming around the tower stones as though the whole sky had joined the fight happening in that small candle-lit room, and nobody yet knew which side it was fighting for. Vance stepped back from the bed and exchanged a long look with Pike, a look that needed no words. Both men had seen this pattern before, in other rooms with other patients, and both men knew exactly what it usually meant. Neither of them said it aloud. Not yet. Not while the Duke still had his son's hand pressed against his own chest, as though his own heartbeat could somehow be lent to the boy who was losing his. The candle on the bedside table guttered in a draught from the window, throwing long shadows across the walls, and for a moment it looked almost as though the shadows themselves were leaning closer to the bed, waiting. Alden closed his eyes and did the only thing left that he knew how to do. He prayed, though he had never been a praying man, whispering words that made no particular sense even to himself, asking whatever might be listening to let his son see one more sunrise. He did not know that a mile away, a young servant girl was pounding her fist against a weathered wooden door in the rain, shouting a name into the storm, and that the woman who opened that door would change everything that happened next in ways none of them could yet imagine. He only knew that his son's breathing had grown fainter, and that the candle was burning low, and that somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, hope had become the only medicine he had left to offer. Marin Ashby had lived at the edge of the river village for as long as anyone could remember, in a small stone cottage with a crooked chimney, and a garden that seemed to grow things no one else's garden ever could. She was a woman past 50, with gray hair pulled back in a rough braid and hands roughened by decades of digging in the earth. She did not smile often, and when she did, it was usually at something other people did not find funny. The village had a complicated relationship with her. The old and the poor came to her cottage in secret at night, when a child had a cough that would not clear or a wound that had gone sour and red. She never turned them away, and she never asked for coin, though most left a chicken or a sack of grain on her step out of gratitude anyway. But the wealthier folk, and especially anyone connected to the castle, spoke of her the way people speak of things they are slightly afraid of and do not want to admit it. A hedge witch, a fraud, a dirty old woman who muttered over weeds and called it healing. Marin had heard every version of the insult over the years. She had stopped caring what any of them thought sometime around her 40th birthday. So when the pounding started on her door that night, hard and frantic, she assumed it was another villager in trouble, another late-night knock that would send her out into the rain with her basket of dried herbs. She was already reaching for her shawl before she even opened the door. Nell Bridger stood on the step, soaked to the skin, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and desperate in the candlelight spilling out from the cottage. "Please," Nell said before Marin had even fully opened the door. "Please, you have to come. It's the Duke's son. It's Corin. The physicians say he's going to die tonight and nobody can stop it, and I don't know what else to do." Marin went very still. She had heard, of course, like everyone in the village had heard, that the young lord had taken ill. Gossip traveled faster than any messenger in a place this small, but she had assumed, as everyone assumed, that the castle physicians with their fine training and their expensive tinctures had it handled. That was what they were for. That was what they were paid enormous sums of gold to do. "The castle has doctors," Marin said carefully. "Real ones, trained ones. What do they need with me?" "They need someone who can actually help him," Nell said, and there was something in her voice, some raw crack of desperation, that made Marin's hardened expression soften just slightly. "I've heard what you did for the miller's girl. Everyone has, please. He's dying and I don't have anyone else to ask." Marin looked at the girl for a long moment, rain dripping from her hair onto the stone step, her whole body shaking with cold and fear in equal measure. Then she looked past her, out at the dark shape of the castle on the hill, its windows lit up against the storm like something holding its breath. "They won't let me through the door," Marin said. "You know that. A woman like me, showing up uninvited, telling trained physicians they've got it wrong. They'll throw me out before I get past the gate." "I don't care," Nell said. "I'll get you through the gate myself if I have to lie to every guard between here and the tower. Please, I've seen him. I've seen his face. He doesn't have much time left." Something in those words settled the matter. Marin had buried enough people in her life, had watched enough fevers win, to know exactly what a face like that looked like, even second-hand, described by a frightened girl in the rain. She turned back into the cottage without another word and began pulling jars and pouches down from her shelves, moving with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before, though never for anyone with a title before their name. Within minutes, she had a leather satchel packed with small clay jars, bundles of dried leaves tied with string, and a heavy stone mortar wrapped in cloth. She pulled a worn wool coat over her shoulders and stepped out into the storm without hesitation, Nell hurrying beside her, both of them soaked through within seconds by the time they reached the castle road. The walk back was faster than the walk there had been, driven now by purpose instead of panic, though the storm had not let up at all. Lightning split the sky over the hills twice, throwing the castle into stark white relief against the black clouds behind it, and Maren found herself thinking, not for the first time, that the weather in this duchy had a strange habit of matching whatever was happening inside those stone walls. The guard at the outer gate did not want to let them through. He was a broad, serious man named Garrick Holt, and he had strict orders about who was and was not permitted into the castle grounds after dark, especially during a crisis this severe. "Nobody goes in without the Duke's word," Garrick said, planting himself in front of the gate with his spear crossed in front of him. "This is the healer," Nell said, breathless, pointing at Maren. "She can help Lord Corrin. Please, Garrick, you know me. You know I wouldn't waste anyone's time with this." Garrick's eyes moved over Maren, taking in her plain, wet clothes, her weathered face, the leather satchel slung across her body. He clearly did not think much of what he saw, but he also clearly remembered, as everyone in the household did by now, that the physicians upstairs had run out of answers days ago. "If the Duke turns her away, that's on your head, not mine," Garrick said finally and stepped aside. They moved through the courtyard at a near run, up the winding stone stairs of the North Tower, the sound of their footsteps echoing against walls that had not heard hurried footsteps in this particular direction in a very long time. When they reached the door to Corrin's chamber, Nell pushed it open without knocking, and the scene inside stopped Maren cold for just a moment. The boy on the bed barely looked alive. His skin had gone gray beneath the sweat, his lips cracked and pale, his breathing so shallow that his chest barely seemed to move at all. The Duke sat beside him, hunched forward, his son's hand still clasped in both of his own, his face carved from exhaustion and grief. Two men in fine coats stood near the window, and one of them, the older one with the neat gray beard, turned sharply at the sound of the door opening. "Who is this?" Elian Vance demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in Maren's plain traveling clothes and the satchel over her shoulder. "This room is for physicians only. Get her out." "She can help him," Nell said quickly, before anyone could move to physically remove either of them. "Please, Your Grace, just let her look at him. What harm could it possibly do at this point?" Alden Whitmore lifted his head slowly, as though it took real effort to turn his attention away from his son's face. His eyes moved over Maren with the same weary appraisal Garrick's had shown at the gate, but there was something else underneath it too, something that looked almost like the last thin thread of hope a drowning man reaches for. "You know herbs," Alden said. It was not quite a question. "I know what grows in the ground and what it can do to a body," Maren said. Her voice was flat, unhurried, entirely unlike the panic filling the rest of the room. "I don't know your son. I don't know what's wrong with him yet, but I've seen fevers like this before, and sometimes the trained men miss the simplest answers because they're too busy looking for the complicated ones." Vance made a sound of disgust low in his throat. "Your Grace, this is absurd. This woman is a village peddler of weeds and superstition. We have exhausted every proper medical remedy available, and now, at the 11th hour, you would allow some hedge healer to—" "Every proper medical remedy has done exactly nothing," Alden said, cutting him off with a sharpness that made even Vance fall silent. "My son is dying in front of me, Dr. Vance. I do not care any more what is proper. I care what works." He looked back at Maren. "Can you help him?" he asked, and this time his voice was not the voice of a duke commanding a servant. It was simply the voice of a father, stripped of every title and every ounce of pride, asking a stranger for a miracle. Maren stepped further into the room, setting her satchel down on a small table near the bed. She looked at Corrin properly for the first time, studying the color of his skin, the pattern of his breathing, the sheen of sweat that would not stop no matter how many blankets they piled onto him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I intend to find out, and I need everyone who isn't holding a candle or a basin of water to step back and let me work." Vance opened his mouth to argue again, but Alden raised a hand, silencing him before a single word came out. "Let her work," the Duke said. Roland Pike shifted uncomfortably near the window, glancing between Vance's furious expression and the Duke's exhausted, desperate one, clearly unsure which authority outranked the other in a moment like this. In the end, both physicians stepped back, though Vance's jaw remained tight enough to crack a walnut. Marin knelt beside the bed and reached for Corin's wrist, pressing 2 fingers against the pulse point the way she had done for hundreds of sick and dying people before him, though never once in a room this grand, with silk sheets and gold candlesticks, and a Duke watching her every movement like his entire world depended on what her fingers found. In a way, it did. She held the boy's wrist in silence for a long moment, her eyes half closed, her lips moving slightly as she counted the rhythm beneath her fingertips. Then she leaned closer, studying the color at the edges of his lips, the state of his eyes when she gently lifted one eyelid, the faint yellow tinge along the whites that nobody else in the room had apparently thought to check for. "He's not shivering because he's cold," Marin said quietly, almost to herself. "He's shivering because his body's fighting something it can't name, and it's running out of strength to keep fighting." "We are aware of that much," Vance said dryly from the window. Marin ignored him completely. She turned Corin's hand over gently, examining his fingernails, then leaned down and smelled his breath, an act so strange that even Alden, exhausted as he was, blinked in surprise. Whatever she found there made her expression shift, just slightly, from focused concentration to something sharper, something closer to recognition. "Bring me hot water," she said, already reaching for her satchel. "As much as you can heat quickly, and I need this room warmer, not colder. Whoever told you to keep him cool was wrong, and every hour you followed that advice made this worse instead of better." Vance's face went red with fury, but before he could speak, Alden was already on his feet, shouting the order down the tower stairs himself, his voice carrying more energy than it had held in days. Something in the room had shifted. It was small, almost impossible to name, but everyone felt it. For the first time in 6 days, someone in that chamber sounded like they knew exactly what they were looking at. Whether that would be enough to save the boy in the bed, nobody yet knew. But for the first time since the fever began, there was a plan in the room instead of only fear, and sometimes, in the darkest hour of the night, a plan is the only thing standing between a person and the edge they are about to fall over. The water arrived in great steaming buckets carried by 2 kitchen boys who nearly tripped over each other getting up the tower stairs. Marin directed them without looking up from her work, telling them where to set the buckets, how close to bring them to the fire, and then sent them away again with instructions to bring more the moment the current supply ran low. She opened her satchel and began laying out small clay jars along the table beside the bed, each one labeled in a cramped, careful hand that only she could read. Dried yellow root, crushed bark from the black willow, a pale powder that smelled faintly of bitter almonds, a twist of dark green leaves that she crushed between her fingers before adding them to a small stone bowl. Vance watched all of this with an expression somewhere between contempt and helpless curiosity, the way a man watches something he wants to dismiss but cannot quite look away from. "What exactly do you believe you are treating?" he said finally, unable to keep the question inside any longer. "You have not even asked what symptoms preceded the fever. You have not asked about his diet, his sleep, the conditions of the ride that preceded his illness. You have simply started mixing weeds together as though that alone will." "He was thrown from his horse 8 days before the fever started," Marin said without looking up. "There's a healing scrape along his left forearm, mostly closed now, but the skin around the old wound is still slightly swollen and warmer than the skin around it. You've been treating the fever as though it came from nowhere. It didn't. It came from that wound going sour beneath the surface, deep enough that it stopped showing on the skin days ago, even while it kept spreading underneath. The room went very quiet. Vance's face had gone pale. He moved quickly to the bed and lifted Corin's left arm, pulling back the sleeve of his nightshirt to reveal a thin, mostly healed scrape along the forearm, exactly where Marin had said it would be. The skin around it did look, now that he was actually looking for it instead of assuming he already knew everything worth knowing, faintly discolored beneath the surface. "That is a minor scrape," Vance said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "A scrape like that would not cause a fever this severe." "A scrape like that wouldn't," Marin agreed. "But a scrape like that, left uncleaned, pressed under a leather riding glove for hours at a time, rubbed raw again and again before it had a chance to heal properly, can turn into something far worse underneath, where nobody's looking. The body starts fighting an enemy it can't push out through the skin anymore, so it fights it from the inside instead, and that fight is what you've been calling a mystery fever for 6 days." Roland Pike stepped closer, staring at the wound with newfound intensity. "How could you possibly know that just by looking at his arm?" "Because I've seen it before," Marin said simply. "More times than I'd like to count. It's not a rare thing in villages where people work with their hands every day and don't have the luxury of clean bandages and quiet recovery. It happens to farmhands. It happens to soldiers. It happened, apparently, to a duke's son who fell off a horse and didn't think a little scrape was worth mentioning to anyone." Alden looked stricken. He never said a word about a fall. "Boys his age rarely do," Marin said. "They think admitting an injury makes them weak. Sometimes that pride costs them more than a bruised ego." She lifted the small stone bowl she had been mixing and held it beneath Corin's nose for a moment, letting the sharp bitter scent drift up toward his face. His nostrils flared faintly, an unconscious reaction, and Marin nodded to herself as though confirming something. "I need clean cloth, boiled first if you have it," she said. "And I need someone to hold his arm steady because what I'm about to do is not going to feel pleasant to him, even as sick as he is." Vance's professional instincts finally overrode his wounded pride. "What are you planning to do?" "Open the wound back up," Marin said, already unwrapping a small folded cloth that held a thin, sharp blade, cleaned and oiled. "Whatever's festering under that skin needs a way out, or his body is going to keep losing this fight from the inside no matter how many tinctures we pour down his throat." "That is extremely dangerous," Vance said. "If done incorrectly, you could introduce further infection or cause bleeding severe enough to—" "I've done this more times than you've written papers, Doctor," Marin said, and for the first time there was a real edge in her voice, sharp and tired of being questioned. "You can stand there and watch me work, or you can leave the room, but I am not going to stand here debating technique with a man whose own treatments have brought this boy to the edge of his grave." Nobody spoke. Alden looked between the two of them, his exhaustion warring visibly with his need to make a decision, any decision that might save his son. "Do it," he said quietly. "Whatever needs to be done, do it." Vance's mouth tightened into a thin line, but he said nothing further. Instead, almost against his own will, he moved closer to the bed and reached out to help steady Corin's arm, muttering something about at least ensuring it was done with proper care, if it had to be done at all. Marin worked with quick, sure movements, her hands entirely steady despite the gravity of what she was doing. Corin flinched weakly when the blade touched his skin, a low groan escaping his cracked lips, but he did not have the strength left to pull away or resist in any meaningful sense. Alden gripped his son's other hand tightly, whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear, his eyes fixed on his son's face rather than on the procedure happening at his arm. What came from beneath the skin was not pleasant, and even Vance, who had trained for years in the study of the human body, grimaced slightly at the sight of it. Marin worked without flinching, cleaning the wound thoroughly, pressing gently along the surrounding tissue to draw out everything that had been trapped beneath the surface, poisoning the boy's blood one slow hour at a time. "This is why the fever kept returning no matter what you tried," she said as she worked, speaking now more to explain than to argue. "You were treating the smoke, not the fire. The tinctures might have eased his symptoms for an hour here or there, but nothing you gave him could reach the actual source, because the source wasn't in his blood or his lungs. It was right here, under the skin, the entire time." When she finished cleaning the wound, she packed it carefully with a poultice made from the crushed leaves and pale powder she had mixed earlier, binding it in place with clean cloth. Then she moved to the bowl of hot water still steaming near the fire and began preparing something else entirely, a dark, strong-smelling tea that she strained through a piece of thin cloth into a small wooden cup. "This won't taste pleasant," she said, lifting Corin's head gently with one hand and bringing the cup to his lips with the other. "But it needs to go down all the same. It'll help his body finish fighting off what's left, and it should ease the shivering within the hour if I've read this right." Corin's throat moved weakly as he swallowed, most of the liquid, though some dribbled down his chin, which Marin wiped away without comment. She set the cup aside and settled into the chair beside the bed, as though she intended to stay there for however long it took, which, judging by the calm, unhurried way she arranged herself, appeared to be exactly her plan. Alden watched her with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last hour from desperate skepticism to something closer to fragile, disbelieving hope. "How long," he asked quietly, "before we know if it worked?" "The wound draining should help almost immediately," Marin said. "But his body's been fighting this for 6 days straight, Your Grace. Even if I've done everything right, he's weak. Tonight will tell us a great deal. Whether the fever breaks by morning will tell us the rest." Vance, standing now at a slight distance from the bed, watched Marin with an expression that had lost most of its earlier hostility, replaced instead by something quieter and far more uncomfortable for a man of his pride to feel. It looked almost like respect, though he was clearly not ready to call it that out loud yet. "You should have been called 6 days ago," he said finally, so quietly that only Pike, standing beside him, seemed to hear it. Marin glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "6 days ago, nobody in this castle would have let me through the gate." She did not say it unkindly. She simply said it as fact, the same flat, unhurried way she said everything, and Vance had no response to offer, because there was none that would not sound hollow given everything that had just happened in this room. Outside, the storm had begun at last to soften, the wind losing some of its earlier fury, the rain settling into a steadier, gentler rhythm against the tower windows. Whether that was coincidence or something else, nobody in the room said aloud, though more than one of them noticed it and felt, however briefly, that it meant something. Corin's breathing, when Alden leaned close to listen, sounded fractionally easier than it had an hour before. Not healed, not saved, not yet, but different in a way that gave the exhausted Duke something he had not allowed himself to feel in 6 long days. Hope that had actual ground beneath it, instead of only desperation holding it up. Marin settled deeper into the chair, pulled a small dried bundle of leaves from her satchel, and set it to smolder gently in a shallow dish beside the bed, filling the room with a faint, herbal smoke that seemed, somehow, to ease the tightness in every face watching it. "Now," she said, looking around at the exhausted faces gathered in the candlelight, "we wait, and we watch, and we do not give up on him no matter how the next few hours look, because fevers like this one often get worse right before they finally break." Nobody argued with her, not even Vance, whose entire career had been built on questioning exactly this kind of statement from exactly this kind of person. He simply pulled a second chair closer to the bed and sat down, prepared, for the first time in his professional life, to watch and learn rather than to lecture. The candle burned lower. The rain softened further. and in the bed between them, Corin Whitmore's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that, however faint, however fragile, had not been there an hour before. The worst of it came just before dawn. Corin's fever spiked so suddenly and so violently that for a moment the entire room seemed to freeze in place, every eye snapping toward the bed as his body began to shake, his back arching slightly off the mattress, a low sound tearing from his throat that did not sound like anything a person should make. "His pulse," Vance said sharply, 2 fingers already pressed against the boy's wrist. "It's racing, far too fast." Alden was on his feet instantly, gripping the bed frame, his face draining of what little color remained in it. "What's happening? Marin, what is happening to him?" Marin was already moving, setting aside the cloth she had been using to wipe Corin's forehead and leaning close, studying his face with an intensity that cut through the panic rising in every other corner of the room. "This is the part I warned you about," she said, her voice steady even as her hands worked quickly, reaching for a small jar and measuring out a careful pinch of dark powder into a cup of water. "The body pushes hardest right before it wins or right before it loses. We won't know which this is for a few more minutes." "A few more minutes," Alden repeated, horror creeping into his voice. "You said that as though we have minutes to spare." "We do," Marin said. "Just barely. Now hold his shoulders steady. I need him to drink this, and he's not going to make that easy." Alden did as he was told without hesitation, pressing down gently but firmly on his son's shoulders while Pike, moving faster than he had all night, helped tilt Corin's head just enough for Marin to bring the cup to his lips. The boy thrashed weakly, his body fighting the intrusion even in its half-conscious state, some of the liquid spilling down his chin and neck. "Come on," Marin muttered under her breath, tilting the cup again, coaxing rather than forcing. "Come on, boy, you've got more fight left in you than this. I can see it." Whether it was her words or simply the last surviving instinct in his fevered body, Corin's throat finally moved, swallowing the bitter liquid in 2 uneven gulps. His body sagged slightly against the pillows afterward, the violent shaking easing into something closer to trembling, though his breathing remained fast and shallow. "Now we watch," Marin said, sitting back slightly, though her eyes never left the boy's face. "The next few minutes will tell us more than the last 6 days did." Nobody in the room moved. Nell, who had stayed pressed against the wall near the door for the entire night, unwilling to leave despite having no real role left to play, found herself gripping her own hands together so tightly her knuckles ached. Vance stood with his fingers still resting lightly against Corin's wrist, counting silently, his lips moving with the rhythm of numbers only he could hear. Alden did not sit. He stood at the head of the bed, one hand resting against his son's damp hair, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left inside him that could be shaped into words. He simply watched and waited and hoped in the raw, wordless way that only a parent watching a child fight for their life truly understands. The minutes stretched longer than minutes had any right to stretch. Outside, the storm had finally passed entirely, leaving behind only a soft gray light beginning to creep along the horizon, the first hint of dawn breaking somewhere beyond the eastern hills. A single bird, somewhere far below the tower, began to sing, an ordinary sound that felt, in that moment, almost unbearably loud against the silence of the room. Then slowly something changed. Corin's trembling eased further. His breathing, which had been quick and shallow for what felt like hours, began to slow, each breath drawing deeper and steadier than the one before it. The tight lines of pain across his forehead softened, his clenched jaw relaxing bit by bit, until his face, for the first time in 6 days, looked almost peaceful instead of tortured. "His pulse is slowing," Vance said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something close to disbelief. "Steadily, not weakening, slowing." Marin leaned forward and pressed the back of her hand gently against Corin's forehead, then against his cheek, then his neck. When she pulled her hand away, her expression, for for the first time all night, shifted into something that might, on anyone else's face, have been called a smile. "The fever's breaking," she said quietly. "Feel his skin, your grace, go on." Alden's hand shook as he reached out and touched his son's face. The heat that had radiated from Corin's skin for 6 relentless days, the heat that had felt like touching a stove left burning too long, had softened into something closer to warm. Simply warm. Human warm. A sound escaped Alden's throat that he did not fully control, something between a laugh and a sob, and he pressed his forehead down against his son's hand, his shoulders shaking silently. Corin's eyes fluttered open. They were clear, not glassy, not distant, not lost somewhere far beyond reach the way they had been for days. Clear, tired, confused, but present, focused, looking up at the ceiling and then slowly at the faces gathered around him. "Father," he said, and his voice, though weak and hoarse from disuse, was steady in a way it had not been since the fever began. "Why is everyone crying?" Alden let out another broken laugh, lifting his head to look at his son's face properly, tears he made no effort to hide streaking down his own cheeks. "Because you scared us half to death, that's why." Corin's brow furrowed slightly, taking in the crowded room, the exhausted faces, the strange woman he did not recognize sitting close beside his bed, with jars and bundles of herbs spread across the table. "How long was I?" 6 days, Nell said softly from the doorway, her voice thick with relief. "You've been fighting a fever for 6 days, my lord. We didn't think. We weren't sure you were going to." She could not finish the sentence, and did not need to. Corin's eyes moved slowly around the room again, more alert now with every passing second, and finally landed on Marin, taking in her plain clothes and weathered hands and the herbs scattered across the table beside his bed. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who was told she couldn't help you," Marin said simply, and decided to come try anyway. Vance, still standing near the bed with his fingers no longer needed at Corin's pulse point, looked at the woman he had dismissed and mocked mere hours earlier, and something in his proud, careful expression finally cracked entirely. "You saved his life," he said quietly. It was not quite an apology, but it was close, closer than a man like Vance had likely come to admitting fault in a very long time. "I was wrong about you, entirely wrong." Marin did not gloat. She did not even look particularly satisfied, simply tired in the deep, bone-heavy way of someone who had spent an entire night pulling a person back from the edge of death through sheer stubborn will and old, hard-won knowledge. "You weren't entirely wrong," she said. "You knew a great deal about medicine that I don't. You just didn't know this particular kind of sickness, and you were too certain of your own training to consider that the answer might be something simpler than you expected." Roland Pike, standing near the window where he had spent most of the terrifying night, let out a long breath that seemed to release days of tension all at once. "I have never seen anything like this," he said, almost to himself. 6 days of nothing working, and then in a matter of hours. "It wasn't magic," Marin said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "It was a wound that got missed, and a fever that got treated wrong because of it. That's all. Sometimes the difference between a mystery and an answer is just looking in the right place instead of the most complicated one." Corin, still weak but growing steadier with every passing minute, managed a small, tired smile, the first real expression his face had shown in nearly a week. "Well, whatever you did, thank you. I think I'd rather like to keep being alive if it's all the same to everyone." A ripple of exhausted, relieved laughter moved through the room, the kind of laughter that comes only after unbearable tension finally breaks. Even Vance allowed himself a faint, tired smile, though it looked slightly unfamiliar on his usually stern face. Alden straightened, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and turned to look at Marin with an expression of such raw gratitude that words seemed entirely inadequate for the moment. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. There is nothing in this castle, nothing in this entire duchy, that I would not offer you for what you've done tonight." Marin began gathering her jars and pouches back into her satchel, her movements unhurried despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "He needs rest now," she said, ignoring the offer entirely for the moment, her attention already shifting back to practical matters. "Broth when he wakes again, nothing heavier for at least 2 days. The wound on his arm needs cleaning and fresh dressing every morning until it closes properly, and someone needs to actually check for wounds like that after every fall from now on, instead of assuming a scrape isn't worth mentioning." She looked pointedly at Corin as she said the last part, and the young lord had the grace to look faintly embarrassed even in his weakened state. Outside the tower window, the sky had brightened from gray to a soft, pale gold, the sun finally rising after the longest night the castle had endured in living memory. Somewhere below, a rooster crowed, an ordinary sound announcing an ordinary morning, though nothing about this particular morning felt ordinary to anyone standing in that small, candle-lit room. Corin Whitmore was alive. The fever had broken, and the woman everyone in the castle had mocked and dismissed just hours earlier now stood at the center of the room, quietly packing away her jars of dried leaves and crushed bark, having done what 2 of the finest trained physicians in the entire duchy could not. 3 days passed before Corin had the strength to sit upright in bed without help, and 5 more before he could walk the length of his chamber without his legs shaking beneath him. The wound on his arm, cleaned and dressed each morning exactly as Marin had instructed, closed cleanly and left behind nothing worse than a thin, pale scar that would fade further with time. The color returned to his face slowly, day by day, until the servants who passed him in the halls stopped exchanging worried glances and started, once again, exchanging smiles. Word of what had happened in the North Tower spread through the castle faster than any official announcement could have managed. By the second day, every servant, every guard, every visiting merchant passing through the gates had heard some version of the story, each one slightly different, slightly more dramatic than the last, though the core of it remained the same in every telling. The physicians had given up. The Herbwoman had not. Marin herself had little interest in the gossip. She visited the castle each morning for the first week, checking Corin's wound, adjusting his tea, answering Vance's increasingly respectful questions about what exactly she had done and why, and then returned to her cottage by the river each afternoon, uninterested in staying longer than the work required. It was on the 8th day, with Corin finally strong enough to take a short walk in the castle gardens, that Alden Whitmore summoned Marin to the great hall, a room she had never once set foot in during her many years living in the shadow of the castle walls. She arrived in the same plain clothes she always wore, her satchel left behind this time since there was no wound left to tend, and stood in the doorway of the vast hall taking in the high stone ceilings, the long banners hanging from the rafters, the enormous table that could seat 40 guests at once, currently empty except for the Duke himself, standing near the great hearth with his hands clasped behind his back. "You wanted to see me, Your Grace," Marin said, her voice as plain and unhurried in this grand room as it had been in the desperate chaos of the sick room. Alden turned to face her, and for a moment he simply looked at her, this quiet, weathered woman who had walked into his home, a stranger, and walked out having saved the one thing in his life he could not bear to lose. "I have spoken with my treasurer," Alden said. "I intend to grant you land, a proper home outside the village, enough gold to want for nothing for the rest of your life, and a formal title recognizing you as healer to this household, with all the respect and protection that position carries." Marin was quiet for a moment, considering the offer with the same careful attention she gave to diagnosing a fever. "That's a great deal of gold for a bit of crushed bark and dried leaves," she said finally. "It's a great deal of gold for my son's life," Alden replied, "which, I would argue, is worth considerably more than gold could ever measure." Marin walked further into the hall, her worn boots quiet against the stone floor, studying the room the way she studied everything, without any particular awe for its grandeur. "I don't need a title," she said. "Titles don't heal anyone, and I don't need land outside the village. My cottage suits me fine. It's close to the river, close to the things I need to grow, close to the people who have trusted me for 30 years without ever needing to be told I was worth trusting by a duke." Alden frowned slightly, clearly not having anticipated this particular response. "Then what would you have from me? Name it and it's yours." Marin considered the question for a long moment, her eyes moving toward the tall windows at the far end of the hall, where sunlight streamed in across the stone floor in long golden bars. "There's a boy in the village," she said finally, "younger than your son. His mother died birthing him, and his father's a fisherman who's rarely home and can't afford to send him anywhere to learn his letters. The boy's clever, the kind of clever that gets wasted in a village his size if nobody ever gives it room to grow. I'd have you send him to whatever school your own son attended, paid for properly, treated properly, given the same chance any nobleman's child would be given." Alden stared at her, clearly having expected a request for something far larger, far more self-serving. "That's all," he said. "After everything you did, that's the only thing you'd ask of me." "That's the thing I'd ask of you," Marin corrected. "Not the only thing that matters to me, but it's the thing I'm asking you for." Alden studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, a kind of respect that had nothing to do with her medicine and everything to do with the woman standing in front of him. "It will be done," he said. "The boy will have his education and anything else he needs besides. You have my word." Marin nodded once, satisfied, and turned as though the conversation had concluded, though Alden was not quite finished. "I would still like to offer you something for yourself," he said. "Not because you're asking for it, because I want to give it." Marin paused near the doorway and glanced back at him. "There's a small piece of land near my cottage," she said slowly, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. "Belongs to the crown, unused, mostly wild growth and river stone. If your treasurer would grant me that plot, I'd have room to grow more of what I need. That's worth more to me than gold sitting untouched in a chest somewhere." "Consider it granted," Alden said, and for the first time since Marin had arrived, something close to a genuine smile crossed his tired face. "Along with anything else that plot requires to make it useful to you, tools, seed, whatever you need." Marin inclined her head slightly, the closest thing to a formal bow she seemed willing to offer, and turned to leave the hall. "Wait," Alden said, and she paused again. "Before you go, my son would like to thank you properly. He's been asking after you every day since he woke." Marin found Corin in the castle gardens exactly where a servant directed her, seated on a stone bench beneath a wide oak tree, still thinner than he had likely been before his illness, but with real color in his face now and real strength in the way. He rose to greet her as she approached. "I was starting to think you'd left the duchy entirely without letting me thank you," Corin said, a faint, teasing smile on his face that suggested his sharp tongue had survived the fever fully intact. "I've been busy," Marin said. "Sick people don't stop being sick just because the Duke's son got better." Corin laughed, a real laugh, the first genuine sound of amusement Marin had heard from him since the night his fever finally broke. "Fair enough. Still, thank you. Properly this time, without a fever clouding my head. I understand from the servants that everyone had rather given up on me." "Everyone with letters after their name had given up on you," Marin corrected. "The people who actually knew you hadn't given up at all. Your father certainly hadn't. That girl, Nell, ran a mile in a storm at midnight because she refused to give up on you. There's a difference between what educated men decide and what the people who love you are willing to do." Corin's expression sobered slightly at that, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "I'll have to thank her too, then, properly. I don't think I even remember most of what happened those 6 days. It's all rather like a fever dream, if that's not too obvious a thing to say. It's exactly what it should feel like, Marin said. The body remembers fighting even when the mind doesn't remember the details. Be glad of that. Some things are better left forgotten by the parts of us that would otherwise carry them too heavily. They walked together through the garden for a while, Corin still moving slowly but steadily, asking careful questions about what exactly had been wrong with him and how she had known to look for it. Questions Marin answered honestly, and without the impatience she usually reserved for people who doubted her methods before they understood them. When they finally reached the garden gate where Marin intended to take her leave, Corin turned to her one final time, his expression more serious than it had been throughout their entire walk. "The physicians are staying on, you know," he said. "My father's keeping both of them in service, despite everything. But he's also asked that you be sent for immediately, the moment anyone in this household falls seriously ill again. Whatever they think of you personally, apparently that no longer matters as much as what actually works." Marin allowed herself a small, tired smile at that, the closest thing to satisfaction she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Good," she said simply. "That's how it should be. Pride's a poor substitute for actually keeping people alive." She left through the garden gate and walked the familiar road back toward the river village, the afternoon sun warm on her shoulders, the castle growing smaller behind her with every step. She did not look back, not out of coldness, but simply because looking back had never been her way. There was a boy in the village whose fever needed checking, an elderly woman with joint pain who was due for a fresh batch of tincture, and a garden at home that had gone neglected for over a week and would need tending before the next storm rolled through. The story of the Duke's son and the Herbwoman who saved him spread through the countryside in the weeks that followed, growing slightly with every telling, as stories always do. Some versions claimed she had brought the boy back from actual death itself. Others claimed she had known some secret, ancient remedy passed down through generations of her family, a claim Marin found particularly amusing given that the truth was far simpler and far less mysterious than anyone seemed to want to believe. But in the village by the river, nothing much changed at all. Marin still opened her door to anyone who knocked, day or night, still asked for nothing more than what people could afford to give, still muttered dryly at anyone who questioned her methods before giving them a chance to work. The only real difference, the one small change that mattered to her, was the boy who now walked the road each morning toward the school the Duke had promised to fund, satchel of books slung over his shoulder, a future opening in front of him that had not existed a season before. Corin Whitmore grew stronger with each passing month, eventually taking up his father's duties as heir with a new seriousness that had not been there before his illness, a quiet understanding, perhaps, of how easily everything a person has can be taken from them without warning. He visited the river village occasionally, never with fanfare, simply to check on the woman who had saved his life, and to ask always whether there was anything the castle could do for the village that it was not already doing. Elian Vance, for his part, spent considerably more time in the years that followed learning from healers he would once have dismissed without a second thought, a quiet, humbling change in a proud man that few people noticed, but that mattered a great deal to those who did. And Marin Ashby continued exactly as she always had, tending her garden, answering her door, asking for nothing beyond what she needed and giving considerably more than she ever received in return, unaware or perhaps simply unconcerned that her name had become, in castles and villages alike, a quiet kind of legend. The physicians had given up, the Herbwoman they mocked had not. And somewhere in that simple, stubborn difference lay the entire truth of what had happened that terrible, storm-soaked night in the North Tower, a truth far simpler than any legend, and far more powerful than any title.